Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the CILT and Pledge Net Zero in 2023 and Beyond webinar. Decarbonisation and net zero is a really key topic at the moment, and I'm delighted to be organising this session in relationship with Pledge, who are a startup who are aiming at helping logistics and transport industries companies to measure, reduce and offset their carbon footprint while also enhancing their value proposition. And we're going to be discussing and sharing net zero strategies and exploring the latest regulations and opportunities in this space during the course of the next hour. I'm incredibly lucky to be joined by a panel of academics, industry experts, tech pioneers and policymakers today. So quickly to introduce, on the panel, I've got Professor Alan McKinnon, Professor of Logistics at Kuehne Logistics University, David Elvy from the Department for Transport, who headed up the DfT's Future of Freight strategy, which we're going to hear more about later. I also have Luke Robinson, who is the Group HSEQ Director for Wincanton, and then Pledge's co-founder and CEO, David Picciotto. Unfortunately, Emma Ross has been unable to join us today, but I'm sure we're going to have a really interesting conversation anyway, and we do miss her. So, before we really get into the conversation, this year is very much about being a pivotal year for the development and commitments to net zero and decarbonisation. Yesterday, we had the CILT UK student conference held by the London region, and that was all about technology in logistics for net zero. Governments around the world continue to increase their demands for companies to prove that they operate in a sustainable and ethical businesses. And a large part of this lies in the supply chain and logistics and transport area of the business. Apparently, 2.4 million people in the UK work in this sector. It's a huge number of people in a huge industry, and we can really make a difference. And transport is has one of the highest reliance on fossil fuels of any other sector. And this is the biggest single contributor to carbon dioxide emissions in the UK. So it's an ongoing theme, and at CILT, we recognise the huge potential and opportunity for transport to help counter climate change, improve sustainability, and make the world really just generally better and not damage it. For anyone who's interested, we have the CILT Route to Net Zero policy campaign, which lays out guidance about opportunities across the sector for how we can play our part in the huge task ahead. Today is going to spark many discussions, and I'm really, really keen for people who are listening and watching to get involved. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A, and my colleagues who are watching and helping me do this will give them to us. The format's going to be, I shall have a conversation with the panel, ask a few questions, and then towards the end of the hour, we'll open up and then we'll pick up your questions now. So please do put your Q&As up, and we'll deal with them when we get there. So to start with, I'd like to turn to Alan. The link between logistics and climate change has been a huge part of your research for many years. Difficult question for one, but is the UK actually on track to meet its net zero targets by 2050? What do you think?
Very tough question to start, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. There's a simple answer to your question, Sharon, and a more complex one. The simple one is no, I don't think we are on the right trajectory. The more complex one takes us back to what we mean by net zero, because there are two sides to it. I mean, there's the mitigation side where we cut emissions, but there's also the sequestration side, where we will have to remove greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. So that the UK government's target for net zero by 2050, there are really two pathways. I mean, one is the downward path in emissions, but there's also an upward path in carbon sequestration, our building up our capability to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. If we deal with the mitigation side first, the UK has set itself very ambitious targets, a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035 against a 1990 baseline. So far, I think we're about 47% on the way, but there's another 31% reduction we will require between now and 2035. I don't think we're on the right trajectory to achieve that, but if one looks at the Committee on Climate Change, because they monitor the trend in carbon emissions. They do this using their 5-year carbon budgets. And if you look at their last progress report to Parliament in 2022, they reckoned that I think there were only credible government policies in place to get us 39% of the way to the 2037 target. So I think therefore on the mitigation side, I don't think we're in the right place. On the sequestration side, we're barely off the ground. And that's not just the UK. I mean, worldwide, I think in 2021, only about 10,000 tons of CO2 were removed from the atmosphere. There's projections for the UK suggesting that by 2030, we'll have to remove between 5 and 10 million tons of CO2. So that will have to be ramped up quite dramatically, I think, this decade to deal with the sequestration side of net zero. So I think you'd have probably preferred the simple answer to that complex one. Okay.
Oh, no, thank you. And I guess nothing in this world is simple, least of all achieving net zero, else we'd possibly be there by now. But that's interesting. David, if I can move on to you. So through Pledge's work, you're helping organisations really better monitor and implement their net zero strategy so we know, well, when they get there. So what do you find are the biggest barriers to organisations in getting going on this net zero journey?
So just to provide a bit of context, so at Pledge, we work with logistics service providers. And what we typically hear from, for example, forwarders there are 3 main challenges who are related to each other and actually at various degrees of complexity. But the first one that comes up the most often is the lack of leadership buy-in. So think a managing director, a CEO, or even the board of a company who don't necessarily see, as of today, the benefit of embarking on a sustainability journey, and as a result doesn't put up the right budgets or personas to deal with that project. Now, assuming you have that buy-in, what we hear is then there's a lack of expertise or education around the topic. What methodologies should I use? Which framework should I use? Is there any accreditation I could pursue? So it's a very complex topic, and often companies, when they start their journey, they lack this expertise. And then the third one, which in my view is probably the most complex one, it's about getting the right data. So what data do I need to compute my emissions and then implement reduction initiatives to hit my net zero targets? How do I follow the right methodologies? And if you think in the context of supply chain emissions, which is where the majority of emissions of companies typically lie, so-called scope 3 emissions, it's often very tedious to collect this data. If you think about a big company who has to get it from suppliers or suppliers, so you have this entire value chain that you need to dig into.
And do you think businesses understand this enough and know what to do to sort of overcome some of these hurdles?
Well, what we see is that there's always at least one champion in a company. Sometimes that champion is the decision maker, which is great because then you directly have the buy-in. Sometimes it's not the decision maker, in which case they typically have to build a business case as to why sustainability makes sense for them. But then comes the question of buy versus build. Do I want to bring this expertise in-house, or do we have somebody in-house that knows how to deal with this topic? Or do I want to use a third party? So obviously you have carbon accounting software solutions like Pledge. You also have consultancies. So this is kind of the next step and decision that companies have to make. But then back to echo my third point, I think it all comes down to also having a solid foundation based on data, because at some point you'll want to automate this entire process. And this is typically done through software and huge amounts of data.
Oh, excellent. Thanks. And I'm going to go over to the other David now. So from a government perspective, really just to talk about what's changed on the regulatory side. So you headed up the Future Freight Plan, which was launched about the middle of last year. And for those who haven't had the time to read the whole document, I mean, we all have on the panel, obviously. Could you provide an overview of the priority areas and the recommended actions the plan set out?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Sharon. The executive summary probably suffices if you haven't, if you're not too worried about the detail. So look, Future of Freight is I think probably the government's first attempt to do a kind of proper long-term cross-modal plan for freight. So the cross-modality is its sort of USP. Government department is sort of structured by mode. We have aviation groups and rail groups and so on. But the kind of insight that was applied to the Future of Freight plan is that the freight is not modal really. Freight is a sort of a complex system of different modes with sort of millions of interactions across those modes each and every day. So that was the approach we took. And we tried to do it as much as possible in collaboration with industry. So we tried to sort of step out of our ivory towers in Westminster and actually go out to industry to understand what the problems are, sort of prioritise those problems, and then try to come up with a sort of series of actions for how we should first start to address the problems we've identified. I think the first bit is important. Future of Freight's designed to be a sort of slightly organic product. And one that will undoubtedly sort of adopt and adapt as the sector changes over time. But the sort of 5 areas we identified back in June last year, 2 of them, sort of understanding the infrastructure and the way freight flows, has sort of tangential implications for decarbonisation, and the same is true of our people and skills chapters. So I won't dwell on those. But the other 3 chapters, I think, are relevant to this discussion. So, I mean, obviously, we have an environment chapter. We can't publish something on freight without addressing the elephant in the room, and we have done. But I think we'll probably talk about this maybe a bit more later. But there's obviously clearly a vast amount of activity across government, not just in DFT, on decarbonisation. So we had to find our sort of niche. And the issue that kept coming back to us in every discussion that we had was the concern about the provision of the zero emission energy infrastructure and how that's going to align with the adoption of the technology by freight operators. So the key action in that space is the creation of a freight energy forum, bring together us, operators, their customers, energy suppliers and distributors, the regulator on the energy side. And through that sort of forum, hopefully at a senior level, probably with ministerial involvement, look to sort of develop a plan. And then we've got 2 other sections, 2 other chapters, which are not absolutely focused on decarb, but I think are highly relevant to it. So the first is on the planning side. Freight and logistics is like every other sector of the economy. It doesn't think the planning system works for it. We think there's probably something in that, but we feel that there's a lack of sort of hard evidence for which we can go into bat for the sector through the sort of national planning policy framework. So the first action is to publish a call for evidence on freight and the planning system, and a part of that is going to be, it's a planning system fit for purpose in terms of facilitating the transition of freight and logistics to zero carbon. It will require infrastructure, not just the provision of sort of large-scale charging networks, but probably subtle changes to distribution centres, to operating centres, and so on. And is the system best placed to do that? And then the other chapter is our innovation chapter. So we've got a small pot of money, 7 million over 3 years, to run a freight innovation fund. That is part of the government's or the department's sort of R&D for decarb. So it will have a strong focus on that. That's the one we got out the door. We published the call for bids in January. I will be doing hour upon hour of commercial due diligence next week, and we expect to make first awards of contract by the end of March this financial year. So that was a quick canter through the Future of Freight.
No, that's excellent, and looking forward to seeing the recipients of the fund. On the planning collaboration, obviously the industry will be keen to get involved. Is there any timelines you can give us so we can keep our eye out for it, so when you call for the evidence we can respond promptly?
I have to be careful with
I know, anything you can say.
Divulging relatively soon.
Okay.
And strong plan to do quite a lot of engagement around it, because actually making sure we get the type of evidence we can really use and going to bat for the sector is going to be critically important. So we want to sort of collaborate and work with you to make sure that we get that.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. Luke, you're the man on the ground doing some of these things. So Wincanton's got a really ambitious target of being net zero by 2040. Can you talk us through some of the initiatives you're going through? What are you looking at to make sure you can meet this goal? And I guess how are you?
Yep. Thanks, Sharon. There's lots of them, so I'll cherry pick and try and give a good spread. One of the first ones is Winsight, so that's our digital transport offering for managing resources. I remember scheduling years and years ago, just having piles of paper everywhere, and that wasn't the best way to get the most out of your fleet. And now we've got much more complex ways of cutting those emissions, and I know we often help customers cut their emissions by a third very, very quickly, so that's a good one. Another one, OneVast. So if we look at warehouse space, that's where we're partnering people who have warehouse space, connecting them together, so that we can optimize what we're doing with that as well. And that's something you can Google it, have a look at it. A really good thing to be able to access, and it's not just something inside Wincanton. It covers everywhere. One of the ones I'm particularly proud of as well. I think we've talked about education a bit as well, haven't we? A couple of years ago, we set up an approved IEMA training centre for sustainability, and I know we're kind of in an educational phase. There's a lot of people passionate about getting to net zero, about sustainability. So we're working right across the business with colleagues, with managers, with senior leaders, to upskill them. And that's something as well that we're not just doing inside of Wincanton. We're offering that as well across the industry. And it's good to have courses, but it's even better if we've got ones that are specific to supply chain and our challenges, and that are not just generic off the shelf.
I know that's really interesting, and CILT UK, we're supporting the Generation Logistics campaign. So I think a lot of the people coming into the industry for the first time, this is an area a lot of them are really keen about, and it gets them very excited. But some of it's very hard for some of us slightly older and been in the profession longer to know, well, what actually is it we should do. So it's brilliant to hear that you're doing this training, and long may it continue.
Great, I'll put some in the post.
Thank you. I thought you might. Alan, I'm going to come back to you. So I like giving you the hard questions, as you've gathered by now. What do you think the air transport and logistics sector could do better when it comes to transitioning to net zero, in particular on freight sites, but more generally, where should we sort of concentrate our firepower?
Okay, in the work I do on the decarbonisation of freight and logistics, I tend to look at what I call my 5 decarbonisation levers. And if we look at those one by one and sort of give a quick progress report, the first one is just reducing the demand for freight transport, something that would not appeal to Luke, I suspect. But in that respect, believe it or not, since 1990, Britain has actually reduced the amount of freight that it sends. Actually, no, by 2000 to 2019, there was actually a reduction in the amount of freight, partly because our economy is restructuring. We're becoming more of a service economy. We don't move as much coal or North Sea oil anymore. So that's an indicator where the trend is actually going in the right direction in terms of decarbonisation. The second lever is moving more freight onto lower carbon transport modes, in particular rail. This one is not going in the right direction because rail's share of the freight market in the UK has dropped, I think from about 12% to 8%. It's gone back to where it was pre-privatisation in the mid-1990s. So that's one where we really have to intensify efforts. And the future of freight document that David mentioned is very strong in looking at ways in which we can get more freight onto rail. The third one is filling the vehicles better. And again, the macro level statistics there are not encouraging. So the amount of empty running of trucks has gone up from, I think, 27% to 30% over the past 20 years. And we want to fill the vehicles. The load factor of the vehicles, again, has remained fairly stable over the past 20 years. So on load factors, I think we have to be doing more. There's the energy efficiency of the vehicles, which need to be improved. We don't have very good macro level data for that. But I mean, new trucks are more energy efficient than their predecessors. There's a lot of investment in driver training and telematics to improve the efficiency with which the vehicles are driven. So I'm hopeful that that's heading in the right direction. And then the final lever is switching to low carbon energy. And that is going to require a move to a new generation of low carbon vehicles, locomotives, ships. That's going to take time, given the long replacement cycle of these assets, and also putting in place the necessary energy. You know, if we move to batteries, we need recharging points and so forth. So that's at a fairly early stage in its development, and I think it certainly needs to be accelerated if we want to get onto a net zero trajectory.
That's interesting. And I was hearing a speaker yesterday. They're starting to reuse the Thames for parcel deliveries, but obviously having to use diesel ships or boats because it's very difficult to charge a boat when it's on the water. But
Yes.
bit of a left field question. What do you think inland waterways might have? Are we going to see the canals coming back into use and the rivers as a fenland dweller? Just as a little aside, what do you think the future potential for inland rivers and waterways might be?
Yeah, I suppose there is some potential. When we discuss modal split in the UK, it's the road-rail balance that we tend to discuss. And that's going to give us more leverage on carbon emissions than making a modest increase in the use of inland waterways. I thought, now, if we were in the Netherlands, I would probably answer that question very differently. But the UK, I don't think, has the same potential. There's also coastal shipping as well, you know, where we can obviously increase our use of that because these are low carbon transport modes. But I think, and I think this is reflected in the Future of Freight document, it's the road-rail balance that I think we're really mainly concerned with.
Yeah. Thank you for indulging me on that one.
Yes.
Yeah. David, I'm going to come back to you again. So when you're talking to your customers, we all know net zero is the right thing to do, but what is it actually that motivates them to start taking action to reduce their impact and you know, getting nearer to net zero? Are there any key themes that come out?
So what we hear the most is often tied to regulation. Now, funnily enough, when we speak to customers, they all say, oh yeah, some regulations are coming up, but they never can point their finger as to what regulation is coming up. So I think there's still a lot of noise around the topic. There are obviously a number of regulations, and I won't name them because they all have funny acronyms on this webinar. But you have regulations that have been implemented already, and more stringent one coming up in 2024 and beyond. I think the most notable one is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which stands for CSRD, being rolled out across Europe. You have similar regulations coming up in the US, and that are in consultation with the SEC. But what that leads to is that if you think about these bigger companies will first have to abide to these regulations, that will create some effects down the supply chain to their supplier and their suppliers. So what we see and hear increasingly is more like none or less obvious motivating factors, such as the ability to secure a competitive advantage. If, for example, I'm a logistics service provider, what we hear consistently now is that as part of tenders, being with existing clients or with new ones, with prospects, shippers require some form of sustainability action or reports from their suppliers. And so this is really creating new business opportunities for these businesses who are forward thinkers. Similarly, embarking on this journey can also yield significant cost savings across, for example, lower energy consumption, especially important in the current macroeconomic context, or the use of more efficient resources. So what we see is this shift from sustainability or climate action being a cost center to it becoming more of a revenue center or an opportunity generation center, which is particularly interesting.
No, thank you. That is, they're almost they are looking at it a different way.
Yeah.
Rather, yeah, that's as an opportunity rather than something they have to comply with. A very bad link about things people have to comply with, but David, I'm going to come across to you, and probably from a positive side of things. How do you recommend that industry engages with sort of government incentives and programs to achieve net zero? And you know, we've talked about the future of freight. Are there any other programs going on that people could perhaps get involved with?
So this is an interesting question. I think there's more than one way of coming at this. I think first, when you say incentives, people's first thought is pound signs or dollar signs. You know, how is the government going to pay for us to do something? But I'll come to that in a sec. But I think that's not the that's not the only way in which government sends signals or incentivizes private markets. You know, it does it through statute and regulation. So, you know, we have the Climate Change Act, which includes kind of carbon budgets, which sort of sets out a sort of trajectory over time towards net zero. Then it does it obviously through sort of policy announcements. You know, in the department, we've got the Transport Decarbonisation Plan and the follow-up net zero strategy. We've announced phase out of internal combustion engine HGVs 2035 and 2040. So there's lots of messages that go out, and those messages are in part to incentivize capital, incentivize research, and so on. So, you know, the first thing I think private business should do is follow and try to keep up with the evolution of government policy. And I realise, you know, if you're a big business like Wincanton, you have probably in-house public affairs teams that will help you to do that. More challenging if you're a smaller operator, but I think that's where trade associations and organisations like the CILT can come into play and help provide that kind of information. So I mean, I think because this is important, because when government money becomes available, you have to be prepared to access it. If the first time you think about a problem or a challenge for your company is at the point that government publishes an invitation to tender for some money, you're probably not going to be successful. You're probably going to be too late. In terms of where we are now, I think probably understandably, we're sort of largely focused on R&D. The pots are mostly R&D focused. Some of them are more latter stage. So the zero emission road freight trial is sort of focused on sort of large scale trial and commercialisation. We're slightly less advanced and it's sort of slightly earlier stage on sort of sustainable aviation fuels and UK Shore, which is looking to sort of focus on domestic maritime. But the sort of total pot of money across those, I've added it up, I think it's probably approaching around 600 million of R&D spend on those three programmes. Most of those will be run by delivery partners like Innovate UK or Connected Places Catapult. So if you want to get involved in those, usually that's the sort of the way to focus on it. Direct sort of financial grants that's not based on sort of competitive tenders, relatively limited at the moment. The plug-in truck grant is a relatively small pot of money to sort of incentivize the take-up of zero-emission HGVs. I think that is administered direct through the dealers, so you don't have to do anything other than turn up and qualify. And then, of course, already mentioned mode shift revenue support grant, which is the sort of the revenue support for modal shift from road to rail. That's administered inside the department. So if you want to get involved in that, probably just come to me in the first instance, and I'll try to remember the name of the person who actually would deal with it. So I mean, at the moment, I would say focus on what the direction of travel that the government is indicating through its statutory and policy statements. So you're prepared for the point at which R&D money becomes capital grant, for example, or when capital grants become available. Keep up, I think, is the sort of message.
No, thanks. That's really interesting, and I would also recommend people the KTN website is very good for funding opportunities and to see what's going on actually. No, thank you for that, and I'm sure you're going to be inundated with people emailing you to find out more. Luke, coming to you. So we're talking about innovation to some extent, and technology is playing a significant role in the route to net zero. I've seen your amazing hub at the Wincanton hub that's in Corby, but could you give us some ideas of the emerging technologies that you're using to help you meet net zero?
Yeah, so we've been using electric vehicles for around 5 years now. You know, a lot will be looking into that. We're going to be moving our company fleet to all electric by 2026. We're involved in ZERFT funding for hydrogen battery electric vehicles and having influence as well with some of the new designers and suppliers of those types of vehicles, which I think is really important. Also, back on what you've just said, actually, Sharon, I think one of the most important things to mention is like a W² program, and the site that you visited, the Innovation Centre. So yes, it's great to have access to a lot of the technology, but that's like our platform to get to early adopters, to put environmental sustainability and ESG as a category, so we can partner and really closely work with new emerging technology providers. So that's a great one. You know, the Innovation Centre and W² itself, and I'll share a link to that one. And it's like our Dragon's Den approach to it.
No, thank you. And it'd be good if you do put the link in, because I was very impressed by it, particularly the little robots that are just wandering around the floor.
Yeah. And it has its own, sustainability has its own section in there too. Yeah.
No, thank you. That's great. Alan, technology. Hopefully this is not quite as hard as some of the other questions. So what technologies have you seen that you think are you know, have got places to apply well, got a good roadmap ahead of them? What have you seen that's impressed you?
Well, one technology I'll plug, because I'm based in Germany, and there's great enthusiasm both by industry and government in Germany, is for highway electrification. Some people think this is science fiction, it will never happen, but I think we've now had 7 years of trials between here and Sweden as well. And this is seen as a very cost-effective way of decarbonising road freight. Okay, it requires a bit of a capital investment up front, typically about 2 to 3 million euros for a lane electrified in each direction on a motorway or autobahn. But it allows what they call dynamic charging of the vehicle, which means that the trucks then would have smaller, lighter, cheaper batteries. It would mean we would require less land for static charging facilities. I was very encouraged to see that in the UK zero carbon, zero freight demonstration exercise, there are 3 technologies being tested, including highway electrification. Because I think on the basis of the evidence that we currently have, I think this will be quite an effective way of decarbonising road freight. But there are skeptics. I mean, some people say it's going to be very hard to drive a truck under an overhead cable. But I think there's sufficient piloting of this technology now to show that it does work. And my expectation is that many governments will now be investing in, not every road will get a catenary overhead, but there'll be a dense enough network to give companies confidence to invest in a new generation of trolley trucks that will derive power from overhead cables.
Oh, that's interesting. Is there much? Is there a proof of concept up and running in Germany already? I'm trying to think if I've seen pictures or not.
Yes, there is. There are 2 trials that have been operating for several years. There's another one currently planned, and I think there are 2 in Sweden as well. Okay, for limited numbers of vehicles so far, but it's demonstrated that the technology works, and it's. If you look at all the various safety criteria, it tends to meet them. So yeah, I think for those people in the UK that probably think this is out the box, I would suggest they have a look at this. There's some very good Siemens YouTube videos that show how this actually works in practice.
No, excellent. Thank you. David, so we've heard a bit about some of the regulation is forcing people to think about net zero. But in your experience, are there people and organisations who are trying to get ahead of the curve? And what advantages does it give them, other than, you know, a nice warm feeling they're doing the right thing? What other advantages are your customers seeing from actually, you know, striving for net zero now?
Climate action is good for business. So I think the sooner that you start, the better off you are, especially if you're amongst the first one to do it. Being seen as a forward thinker definitely helps gain trust from customers, as we mentioned. But also importantly, employees, in a world where a lot of the workforce is looking for purpose in their day-to-day, but also interestingly from investors. If we think about pension funds who increasingly put a big scope on the impact that their dollars have, or even from a loan standpoint, companies needing to secure debt are often tied to certain climate or ESG metrics. So definitely to improve this stakeholder engagement, I think the sooner you start, the better off you are. The second point is probably around risk mitigation. around, for example, supply chain disruption, or as we discussed, increase in energy prices, or potentially also the risk of reputational damage that non-action can cause. And ultimately, it's also about lowering your compliance costs. As you mentioned, regulations are coming. So by acting early and proactively, you can reduce the cost that you will have to incur in the future when these regulations become mandatory.
Oh, excellent, thank you. Luke, I think we've touched on data before. There is a huge amount of data out there, and businesses have to try to work out how to analyze it. And for a long time, it was sort of said, you know, data is the new oil. And I think I'm of the opinion data is the new snake oil. We need it, but we're not quite sure which bits of it we need. So what experience have you got of managing this data and actually getting insights out of it, rather than just getting completely overwhelmed by it and knowing that the information is out there somewhere, but we don't know what it means? And particularly when you're trying to analyze impacts or what you should do in future. Yeah,
this was a particularly tough one. You can very easily get lost in the data. You know, you as sustainability professionals, you could spend an infinite time reporting on metrics, collecting that data, producing it rather than consuming it and making an impact. So we've got a real focus on where we can have the biggest impact, making sure we're not getting lost in that, and also when it comes to having resources like an analyst and software platforms as well. But really, it's getting that balance right, isn't it, between producing it and really focusing on what you can actually do about the data.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah,
it's an unquenchable thirst for it, isn't there?
Yeah, I do remember somebody once saying if we ever went for road user charging, they'd need a server the size of Belgium or something to store all the data. I think they may have been exaggerating. We're getting quite a few questions in the chat, so I may pop over to them for a moment. And there was one I particularly liked the sound of. It was about, and this might be a David Elvy one, what large-scale planning changes are needed? I mean, if you can't answer it, please tell me, but what do we need to decarbonise the freight network? We're going to use current technologies. How do we get around some of the existing planning limitations?
So I think this is ultimately the purpose of the call for evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, I think let's have as a starting point, the planning system is not hopeless. You know, millions of square foot of warehousing have been built. Distribution hubs are springing up. The question is whether or not it's optimized. And that I think will apply equally to the provision of permission to build the necessary additional infrastructure on a site, permission to have perhaps multiple uses, change of use to facilitate the transition to net zero. I don't think this is a sort of it's not a fundamental problem. This is about sort of identifying where improvements could be made and making those incremental improvements that will help to speed things up. I don't necessarily think that there's a sort of massive step change that's going to be required.
No, thanks. I think that was probably quite a specific one, but a more general one for people on your experience. So one of our audience has asked, is there a calculator readily available for businesses to calculate their freight carbon dioxide emissions? And they're saying there's a sort of plethora of websites that do this, but is the one that's either approved by government or is recognised as being a good one, a good tool to use? Alan, possibly, are you a good person to answer this?
I'll do my best, yeah. So there is an organization called GLEC, the Global Logistics Emissions Council, that was set up in 2014. And they set out a methodology and they've identified emission factors. The purpose of the exercise really was to harmonize the measurement of emissions, because as David said earlier, many companies who come to this for the first time are confused because they're not sure what methodology and reporting standard to use. I mean, later this year, the ISO is going to release a new standard for the measurement of emissions from freight transport. If I recall, it's going to be 14083. I think, yeah, David's nodding. So, yeah, which I think is well aligned with GLEC. And also, although we've left the EU has a big initiative called Count Emissions EU, which is going to standardise the measurement of freight emissions across Europe. And it would make sense, I think, for the UK to fall into line with that. So there are systems. What I find many companies doing is they go to a website called EcoTransit, which is a tool that you can use on a trip by trip or lane by lane basis to compare the carbon intensity of different options, you know, road, rail, sea, and so forth.
So maybe to interject and complement what Alan shared. So there are a number of companies, including Pledge, EcoTransit, and others who follow this GLEC framework. But importantly, a lot of these companies are also accredited by this body called the Smart Freight Center, who's developed this methodology. And so while it's not a government who recommends the tool, it's still the third-party assurance of that leading industry body that has reviewed that all these providers adhere to that framework, which is probably the assurance that you're looking for as part of your question.
Thanks. And then leading on from that one, another viewer has said, the freight emissions can be measured in different ways, well to tank, tank to wheel, well to wheel. Is there a preferred approach, or what are the differences in these metrics? I'm afraid that's probably maybe another Alan one, sorry, unless anybody else would like to jump in.
I'm happy to take it otherwise.
Yeah. Yes, I'll start and you can follow up, David. Yeah, I mean, most of the data and emission factors we have for freight are tank to wheel emission, but we really have to migrate to well to wheel or field to wheel. I mean, it depends where we're sourcing our fuels, because that will then give us a much more comprehensive overview. And when you migrate from tank to wheel to well to wheel, you often get quite significant differences in the relative carbon intensity of different carriers or different modes. But David, you might want to elaborate on this subject.
Yeah, so I'm totally echoing that measuring emissions across both stages, so well to wheel gives the most accurate representation of the carbon footprint. Just maybe for context, for those who don't know the definition, so well to tank refers to the fuel extraction and the refinement, and the tank to wheel refers to the fuel disbursement. What, for example, tracking both sides allows us to do is that if you think about tracking tank to wheel, this will help you measure the impact of changes or of different fuel used by yourself or your company, your supply chain. So that's where you can make better decision to meet your reduction goals. Oh. And in the context, again, of the GLEC framework, we can typically and should measure both.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've got one for David Elvy here, and somebody's asking that on the subject of third-party funding, the challenge appears to be convincing the Treasury. It does say, what guidance can you provide? I'm guessing if you've got that one cracked, you might not be sitting on this call with us, but are there any tips you can provide in people when they're looking at their business cases and the like for funding?
So in this space, I think there are funding pots that will come out of BAYS. There are funding pots, it's not called BAYS anymore, sorry, I haven't managed to memorize the new terminology for the restructure. Funding pots that come out of DFT. There will be relatively few, if any, funding pots that come directly out of Treasury. So I mean, Treasury is a revenue raising and distribution hub, if you like, through which departments bid for their spending allowance on a sort of spending review 3-year cyclical process. So I mean, I think in terms of sort of private businesses looking for where those sources of funding might be coming from, probably not. Treasury is probably not the place to look. It's kind of the DFT and other departments' jobs to work to make the case for their spending envelopes with the Treasury, with the opportunity then to distribute it accordingly.
No, yeah, excellent. Thank you. I think it probably applies to all of these business cases when you're developing them, that you've got to look at how the value for money is calculated and what it represents, and maybe looking a bit wider. We've had a couple of questions about future of fuels and what the future propulsion mechanism is going to be. And this is one, there's an awful lot of discussion. Is it electric vehicles? Is it hydrogen? Is it the overhead wires? Is it something we've not thought of yet? But I think I was going to come to Luke on this one. What sort of discussions have you had within Wincanton about other options other than just batteries? Have you thought about hydrogen or the overhead wire systems? Where's your thinking going?
It's hard to say, isn't it? But what I might do is just share a bit of an insight. You know, for me, it sounds like it's going to be a combination of a lot of things. When I've met with a hydrogen vehicle supplier, I won't name them, but I'll just share some of the things they shared with me because I found them particularly interesting. So they were talking about you know, they've got prototype vehicles at the moment. They're on tracks. They're not on the road yet. They'll be testing those rigorously in around 2026. And you know, I'm not saying these dates will happen because you know it's very hard to say. But this is what they were saying. Going into more mass production in 2027, and a really interesting part here, they were saying that they believe that the total cost earnings and break-even costs will be in around 2029. So I don't know if that helps a little bit with trying to figure out where a lot of this technology is. But I think the main thing that I'm finding out is we're going to have to change the way we look and maybe focus more around the vehicles and the fuels as opposed to how we've always done it.
Would anybody else like to add into that one?
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Because you know, to decarbonize, it has to be green hydrogen we use in these vehicles, and currently we have only a very small amount of green hydrogen. We're going to have to ramp up the electrolysis of water with low carbon electricity to achieve that. That's one issue. The other issue is the amount of energy low carbon energy that you lose in going from the electrolysis of the water through to the wheel of the vehicle, as much as 70%. And so, I mean, the work I've done in this and many others feel that while hydrogen probably will have a niche role to play in the decarbonisation of trucking, it's not going to be very great. If you look at the situation here in Germany, the German government recently tried to figure out what the division of truck sales in 2030 would be between diesel, battery, and hydrogen. I think hydrogen was 17%, batteries 2/3, and then diesel the rest. So the feeling is, even in a country which is bigger than the UK, like Germany, the feeling is it's going to be batteries that will be the main way in which we'll decarbonise trucking, and probably supported with overhead catenaries as well in some cases. Yeah.
And I suppose leading on from that, I mean, I know there are 1 or 2 hydrogen trains. If we'd like to get more freight on the railway as a way of decarbonising. Any thoughts on hydrogen trains? Just as is it feasible? Is it likely, or is it sort of in the same category as the lorries? There may be few and far between.
I think before we do that, I mean, I would like us to see us extending the electrification of the UK rail network, because you only have to plug some gaps in that network for freight trains to quite significantly increase the proportion of electrically hauled trains in the UK. So I would see that as probably a better pathway, but there will always be a need for some freight trains to run off the electrified network, and hydrogen may be a possibility in that case. Yeah.
And so we're looking at the future. We know a lot of warehouses are being built, are being planned, road networks are being built, being planned. And we've touched on the infrastructure before, but you know, when we're going to be starting putting warehouses in, they need to be resilient for the future and future-proof, which is quite tricky. And this is probably a question to everybody. I mean, you know, solar panels on warehouse roofs are quite common. Should we be looking at other things? Should we have wind turbines at every warehouse? Are there other ways we could do this? Anaerobic digesters, you know, from the local supermarkets. Has anybody seen any really good examples, either in the UK, around the world, or how the warehouse and depot facilities themselves are being made carbon neutral?
If I can come in, I think I'm right in saying the the building that has got the reputation for being the most environmentally friendly industrial building in the world is in the Netherlands. It's in Tilburg, and it's a warehouse, which is covered with 13,000 solar panels, which powers all the activities in the warehouse, and also I think about 700 homes in the surrounding area. So there's huge potential for roof solar here to help to decarbonize. Even a country like the Netherlands, which like the UK, doesn't get this amount of sunshine you would get in Africa, for example, but we can still take full advantage of that.
Excellent. Has anybody else seen anything when they've been talking to either clients or amongst themselves? Shame.
I would like to have a look at that warehouse, though.
Yeah, exactly. I think there may be a trip out to it.
Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about the big stuff, the lorries, the trains, but what about last mile delivery? We've seen all manner of cargo bikes, electric tuk-tuks going around, you know, predominantly cities. For this last mile delivery, this sort of combination of active delivery, it's obviously got a place, but how feasible is it? How much freight can be, or small scale freight can be moved out of, say, a white van and onto, you know, a last mile person with a cargo bike? Has anybody any feelings about that or seen any work in progress? And obviously there's the little delivery robots that scoot around Milton Keynes and Cambridge quite happily. But what have you seen coming along when you've been doing more experiments? I mean, Luke, are Wincanton trying anything around this?
Yeah, so we've got electric and net zero 2-person home delivery, but I think that's a very complex question to answer, that one.
Yeah,
I think what I've seen more from the company side and different last mile delivery providers using a cargo bike as a mean of transport is that quite a few have seen the light of day over the past few years. A lot have disappeared, mostly because they were not in cities that were dense enough. So I think looking at density is especially important in that context to make this mode of transport relevant and feasible.
The academic research in this area is very encouraging. I mean, there was a big study done in Portugal, for example, looking at the extent to which you could switch from vans to cargo bikes, and then looking at the carbon impact of that. I mean, clearly, we're never going to replace all van traffic with cargo cycles. They have a role, and the percentage of cargo cycle deliveries will vary from city to city. But definitely, I think it's something to be encouraged, and it is a very effective way of decarbonising last mile logistics. I mean, I actually lectured to my students on this subject this morning, so this is at the front of my mind. The McKinsey and the World Economic Forum 2 or 3 years ago looked at a scenario for largely decarbonising last mile logistics. So partly cargo cycles, partly the use of batteries, obviously in vans. Locker banks would be something else. And a third thing, which is perhaps harder to achieve, is getting parcel carriers to collaborate and to share vehicle capacity within urban areas. That's been attempted, but it's difficult to get them to agree to do that.
That's interesting. So there's a couple. One person's asked about using additive manufacture as a way of improving sort of carbon balance. You're grinning, Alan. Would you like to take that one?
Yes. I've been an academic in this field for so long. I've done research in so many areas. I've done research on this one as well. There was a study done in the Netherlands 2 years ago where they asked a lot of experts about the likely effects of 3D printing on the decarbonisation of freight transport. And there was a whole array of opinions. The experts very much disagreed on this area. And I think there's no question it will help to streamline supply chains. Right, so it will reduce the number of links and reduce the number. A lot will depend on the extent to which it develops at the front end of the supply chain. You know, if we 10, 20 years from now have domestic 3D printers that will make a range of consumer products, that could certainly have a big impact. But in the medium term, I would have thought the impact is going to be quite limited. It will impact on certain sectors, but the overall effect on the carbon intensity of logistics, I think, will be quite modest for, say, the next 10 years.
Anybody else would like to come in on this one? I think my feeling has always been with additive manufacturing, you've still got to move the base material around.
Exactly.
So yes, it's not like the Star Trek generator that suddenly produces things from nothing.
No.
So this sort of ties in with data and also a bit about management and how we manage fleets, but how do we motivate companies to increase their load factor? It's, you know, in a time where people want almost instantaneous deliveries, this is a sort of trade-off between delivery time and load efficiency. I don't know, Luke, have you got any thoughts on this?
I was in a discussion about this the other day. So, you know, people want the delivery straight away, but I think where that's, you know, correct if I'm wrong, everyone, but where it's happening most successfully, it's where you get given a time when it's going to be delivered as opposed to choosing it. And I think that's part of the way towards helping with that. And I think there's some companies doing that very successfully and collaborating together.
Yeah, excellent. Alan, did you want to? Sorry, I know the other two I'm leaving you out. David's, I'm leaving you out of it, but Alan.
A couple of things on that. We've not said much about digitalization of freight transport and the likely effects that will have on decarbonisation. So we've had online trading of freight capacity for 20 years now, but it's now much more sophisticated with the use of artificial intelligence and so forth, machine learning, big data. So I think that will certainly help companies improve the loading of their vehicles. The other thing is just in time, because in this subject area, I'm often asked, you know, should we be relaxing the just in time principle in an effort to cut carbon emissions from freight transport? I think that would help us improve the loading of vehicles and improve the carbon efficiency of road freight. But we've got to see the wider implications, because I think if you relax the just-in-time principle, it could well increase energy consumption in warehouses and in factories. So unless you do a holistic analysis of all of this, I would be very hesitant about relaxing just-in-time simply to try to decarbonise road freight operations.
Oh, that's interesting. And just in the last minute, we've got probably just come back to the two Davids below. Just really, so David Elvy, if you could say one thing very briefly to sort of encourage people when they're thinking about decarbonisation and net zero and how it seems like a big mountain to climb, just give us some positive thoughts from the government, why they think we should be doing this.
Because if we do, the consequences if we don't do it, don't achieve the targets that we've set, don't take the opportunity to potentially sort of have adopts the sort of global leadership and the opportunities that brings, the outcomes will be relatively catastrophic. I think the other thing I would say is my experience talking to the logistics sector over the course of the last sort of 2 or 3 years is the biggest problem at the moment is uncertainty. No one likes the vacuum. So there's please government, tell us what the answer is. I'm going to be most interested in how that evolves. I think as the answers start to become clear, we'll start to see some of the sort of early adopters and the more innovative end of this industry start to drop off the calls for certainty and start to make the money that they've identified they can make. I think we're just in a difficult period at the moment where across beyond sort of the small van end of the market, the technology uncertainty is causing concern. I mean, I did very much take Alan's point about trajectory and being on course, but there's a lot of innovation, a lot of research and development taking place in this space. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the curve steepen.
Thank you. And just in the last, I was going to say in the last seconds, David, any views from your side? What's the one word of encouragement you can give?
I think if companies start thinking about carbon pricing, so put a price on their emissions, on their pollution, I think this will help them better prepare for the future where this will become mandatory and ubiquitous. Because if you start knowing the cost each year you incur for polluting, by the time this arrives, I think you'll be better prepared. So the sooner you start, the better off you'll be.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, my panel. Thank you very much to everyone who's been watching and putting so many questions up that I couldn't follow them all. And I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.